July 1960. 26-year-old Jane Goodall stepped ashore at Gombe Stream, a narrow crescent of forest and ravine on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, near Kigoma in western Tanganyika, now Tanzania. She arrived under the auspices of Louis Leakey and the New York Zoological Society, today the Wildlife Conservation Society, to work in what was then the Gombe Stream Game Reserve, established in 1949 and later designated Gombe Stream National Park in 1968. Goodall came as an amateur naturalist with a battered notebook, an iron will, and no formal degree in primatology, a combination that made her both an unlikely field scientist and a lightning rod in academic circles. At the time, much of the scientific world regarded chimpanzees as instinct-driven automatons and treated tool manufacture as a uniquely human trait. Leakey disagreed and sent Goodall to test that idea by patient, close observation. The stakes were epical. If chimpanzees showed learned behavior, tool use, or complex social bonds, the tidy line separating Homo sapiens from other apes would erode, forcing revisions across anthropology, ethology, and evolutionary theory. Practically, the work demanded surviving severe logistical challenges and tropical privations. Gombe's steep ravines and Miambo woodland funneled humid, dust-swirled air. Mosquitoes and tsetse flies were constant nuisances and carriers of disease, with malaria a persistent threat. Supplies arrived infrequently by steamer to Kigoma, and the journey inland required porters and long, patient planning. There was no reliable electricity, phone service, or laboratory, and colonial bureaucracy and permit hurdles added administrative friction as Tanganyika edged toward independence. Goodall's method, slow habituation, individual recognition, and directly naming chimpanzees, would bring both insight and controversy. She arrived ready to camp on the forest's edge, to learn Swahili, to rely on Tanzanian assistance, and to turn small, exact observations into claims that might upend scientific orthodoxies. That compact of risk, place, and purpose set the scene for first encounters that would redefine primate science. From July through the closing months of 1960, Jane Goodall turned the ragged, sun-bright rim of Gombe into an exacting theater of patience. Habituation became a disciplined craft. She sat motionless on the forest edge, learned Swahili and the rhythms of local trackers in Kigoma, and filled a battered notebook with hours of tiny gestures. By autumn, she could identify individuals by gait, scar, and facial architecture. She broke with prevailing field etiquette by giving each chimpanzee a proper name. Most famously, David Graybeard, a male showing the first gray on his chin, was named so that descriptions stayed tethered to persons rather than anonymous statistics. Naming was not sentimentalism, but a deliberate method that let her track behavior over time and attribute subtle differences in temperament, preference, and strategy. The slow accrual of trust produced repeated, intimate encounters. Chimps that once fled would linger at the forest edge, then feed within arm's reach as Goodall refused to force contact and instead matched their tempo. Maybe clicking subscribe would have saved them. In November 1960, that painstaking habituation produced a finding that would rattle received scientific wisdom. On separate visits, she watched David Graybeard select a slender twig, strip its leaves with deft fingers until a smooth shaft remained, insert it into a termite mound, and withdraw it with termites clinging to the tip. She recorded this as deliberate tool manufacture and tool use. She also observed leaf sponges, chimps folding leaves into a porous cup to soak up drinking water from tree holes. These were not isolated tricks, but repeated, purposeful actions showing foresight, material selection, and technique. Goodall documented temperament as precisely as technique. David Graybeard behaved with a mild, contemplative reserve. Other individuals displayed brash aggression, solicitous grooming, or calculated alliance building. She wrote detailed accounts of play that looked like rehearsal for adult politics, of mothers showing tenderness and careful protection, and of males demonstrating rivalry and coalition. Each entry tightened the central tension. If chimpanzees learned techniques, planned, and exhibited distinct personalities, The long-held claim that tool use and complex social life were uniquely human was demonstrably false. News of the termite fishing and leaf sponges reached Louis Leakey and a skeptical academy, and by winter 1960, Goodall's notebooks had set the stage for a confrontation between field evidence and entrenched theory, setting up larger challenges to come in Act Two. In the 1960s and 1970s, Jane Goodall's battered notebook became a ledger of personality and policy in the sunlit amphitheater of Gombe Stream. Between 1961 and 1973, she made systematic entries. Mothers who nursed and carried infants for years, disciplined juveniles with sharp slaps, and taught nesting and foraging techniques. These were not vague maternal instincts, but prolonged individual strategies that shaped offspring survival. She tracked mothers like Flo, a steady presence in the Cassiquela community, whose reproductive history and child-rearing choices could be followed through droughts and fruit flushes. Hunting moved from the margins into routine. By the mid-1960s, Goodall recorded coordinated raids on red colobus monkeys along Gombe's ridge, parties of males, and sometimes females, moving with measured stealth to seize and butcher prey. Meat sharing followed patterns. Successful hunters often handed chunks to allies and juveniles, a kind of currency that lubricated alliances and boosted status. Grooming and food exchanges became the architecture of power. Males who shared meat more often rose in rank, and mothers allied with powerful males could secure protection for their young. Over years, coalitionary ties hardened into political blocs. Aggressive displays, piloerection, pant hoots, chest beating, escalated not simply as raw instinct, but as calculated intimidation to defend resources, mates, and territory along the narrow coastal strip of Lake Tanganyika near Kigoma. From 1974, that simmering competition erupted into open war. Between 1974 and 1978, the Cassiquela community waged a protracted, lethal campaign against a neighboring group, later called the Gombe War. Patrols and ambushes along border ravines culminated in systematic killings and the disappearance of the Kahama community from Gombe. These were repeated, coordinated acts of intergroup violence that expanded Cassiquela's range and reshaped the park's demographics. The Gombe War shocked colleagues. Lethal coalitionary aggression was no longer a human monopoly. Scientific debate intensified. Critics accused Goodall of anthropomorphism for naming chimps and attributing intentions, and some questioned whether habituation, provisioning, or proximity to humans affected behavior. Defenders pointed to decades of meticulous records, dates, troop compositions, death registers, birth logs, arguing that only long-term observation reveals emergent social strategies. The empirical stakes were explicit. If chimpanzees formed coalitions, exchanged meat for political support, and carried out lethal raids, theories of human uniqueness in planning, cooperation, and organized violence had to be reconsidered. The controversy widened the field and set the stage for the decisive confrontations and conservation reckonings to come. After the Gombe War, Gombe's ledger grew heavier with unease as well as detail. Jane Goodall and her assistants turned habit and heartbreak into a methodical census, compiling birth registers, death logs, and daily behavioral notes from 1960 onward. Those notebooks became the clear record of an unfolding decline. Gombe Stream National Park, declared in 1968, could not stop the pressures beyond its rim. Tanganyika gained independence on December 9, 1961, and the 1964 union with Zanzibar created the United Republic of Tanzania. Those events accelerated settlement and agricultural expansion around Kigoma. Subsistence farming, livestock grazing, and charcoal production steadily carved away the miombo and riparian forests that chimpanzees relied on. The notebooks recorded the demographic arithmetic in plain figures: years with high infant mortality after lean fruit seasons, cohorts thinned by snares set for duikers and other bushmeat, and home ranges clipped by new fields and villages. By the 1980s and 1990s, the data showed repeated population swings. Communities that had rebounded after the violence of the 1970s later stalled or declined as the carrying capacity for primates contracted along the lake's narrow coastal strip. Poachers left snares that maimed young chimps. A single wire could turn a mother into a memory and an infant into a long-term orphan listed in Goodall's registers. Disease added a cruel, invisible tally. Recurrent respiratory epidemics, traced in field notes and later confirmed by virological studies, revealed human pathogens spreading through proximity, researchers and tourists, visiting officials and local children. Pneumonia and other contagions produced clustered mortalities, recorded with precise dates and names. Those outbreaks forced academic debate into urgent conservation triage. The Jane Goodall Institute, founded by Goodall in 1977, became both sanctuary and sentinel. It used the longitudinal records accumulated since July 1960 to argue for intervention. Anti-poaching patrols coordinated with Tanzanian authorities, community education in Kigoma districts, and efforts to reduce risky contact that transmitted pathogens. The science hardened into moral clarity. The ledger's columns, species counts, territory maps, kinship trees, no longer served only scholarly quarrel, but legal petitions, grant proposals, and diplomatic appeals to preserve habitat corridors. Decades of methodical observation made the decline impossible to dismiss as episodic noise. The evidence pointed to systemic risk, shrinking habitat, escalating human encroachment, persistent snares, and recurrent disease events converging to push Gombe's chimps toward a fragile precipice. That convergence set the stage for the coming reckoning, when conservation would have to match the scale of the crisis exposed in those sepia-stained pages. Faced with the ledger of losses compiled since July 1960, Jane Goodall moved from chronicler to campaigner, turning 30 years of sepia-stained notebooks into a clear public case for protection. Her 1971 book, In the Shadow of Man, and decades of National Geographic coverage had already opened public attention. In 1977, she formalized the effort by founding the Jane Goodall Institute to translate longitudinal science into concrete protection for Gombe Stream National Park and the surrounding Kigoma districts. She used precise birth and death registers, territory maps, and documentation of the Gombe War, 1974 to 1978, as evidence in grant proposals and policy briefs submitted to the Tanzanian government and international donors, insisting that policy follow data. The Institute funded anti-poaching patrols in coordination with park rangers, backed community education programs in villages around Lake Tanganyika, and pushed for stricter field health protocols to reduce respiratory outbreaks linked to human contact. Goodall campaigned relentlessly, giving lectures in London, New York, and Nairobi, making targeted appeals to conservation funders, and using media to put names like David Greybeard and Flo before an engaged public, turning empathy into funding and volunteers. In 1991, she launched Roots and Shoots to mobilize youth worldwide in practical, locally led projects that link village livelihoods to habitat preservation. At the same time, the Institute established rescue and rehabilitation for snare victims and supported veterinary interventions during epidemics. The decisive shift was procedural as well as rhetorical. Decades of patient observation became protocols, patrols, programs, and formal partnerships with Tanzanian authorities. That conversion of rigorous science into coordinated protection resolved the central tension by transforming discovery into organized defense and preparing the ground for long-term impact. Jane Goodall turned meticulous field notes into institutional action that reshaped both science and conservation. Her July 1960 arrival at Gombe Stream, the November 1960 discovery of chimpanzees fishing for termites, the Gombe War, 1974 to 1978, and decades of records on individuals like David Greybeard and Flo forced scientists to revise ideas about tool use, personality, and culture in pan troglodytes. In the Shadow of Man, 1971, brought these findings to a wide public. She founded the Jane Goodall Institute in 1977 and launched Roots and Shoots in 1991. The result is a sepia-toned archive, arguably one of the longest behavioral data sets. spanning July 1960 to the present and supplying detailed birth and death registers, territory maps, and behavioral time series used across primatology, epidemiology, and conservation planning. Those data have powered anti-poaching patrols, veterinary responses to respiratory outbreaks linked to human contact, and community programs around Kigoma and Lake Tanganyika. Yet Gombe remains a conservation battleground. Habitat loss, snares, and disease continue to threaten chimpanzees, which are listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. The legacy is both practical and philosophical, proof that culture and planning extend beyond our species, and a living reminder that knowledge without action leaves Gombe, and us, at risk. What will we do with what we have learned?